The early morning sun peeked through the windows of Golden Palace restaurant as Mai hustled between tables, balancing steaming baskets of dim sum on both arms. Her feet ached from the previous day's double shift, but she maintained her warm smile as she served her regular customers. The restaurant buzzed with the familiar sounds of clinking teacups and animated conversations in multiple languages. Between taking orders and refilling teapots, May's mind wandered to the storage room at the back of the restaurant. Hidden behind stacks of rice bags and sauce containers sat her most precious possession, an erhu, a traditional Chinese two-string violin that had been in her family for 3 generations. The instrument's wooden body was worn smooth from years of use, its surface telling stories of countless performances and practice sessions. Every night, after the last customer left and the kitchen staff headed home, May would slip into that quiet storage room. She'd carefully move aside the boxes of takeout containers and pull out her erhu from its hiding spot. The familiar weight of the instrument in her hands always brought back memories of her life before coming to America. Memories of prestigious concert halls, thunderous applause, and dreams that seemed within reach. 10 years of rigorous training at the Shanghai Conservatory had shaped her into a promising musician. Her instructors had called her a prodigy, predicting she would one day perform with the world's greatest orchestras. But life had other plans. Her father's sudden illness and mounting medical bills forced her to leave everything behind. The family sold almost everything they owned, except for the erhu. Her grandmother had insisted she keep it, saying, "Music finds its way back to those who are meant to play it." Now, as Mai maneuvered through the busy restaurant, nobody would guess that those hands expertly handling plates and teapots had once drawn audiences to their feet in standing ovations. Her coworkers knew her as the reliable waitress who never complained about working extra shifts and always helped new employees learn the ropes. Only Mr. Wong, the elderly dishwasher who sometimes stayed late to finish his work, knew her secret. He would occasionally pause outside the storage room door, listening to the haunting melodies that floated through the thin walls. During busy moments at work, May would sometimes catch herself unconsciously tapping out rhythm patterns on her order pad or humming classical pieces under her breath. A few customers had commented on her beautiful humming, but she always brushed off their compliments with a shy smile and a quick change of subject. The storage room had become her sanctuary, a place where she could reconnect with her true self. Late at night, after her fingers had grown stiff from carrying heavy trays, she would work through her old practice routines. The erhu's gentle voice would fill the small space as she played pieces she had performed countless times before. Traditional Chinese melodies that told stories of love, loss, and hope. Some nights, when the moon cast long shadows through the small storage room window, May would close her eyes and imagine herself back on stage. In these moments, her waitress uniform transformed into a flowing concert gown, and the stacked boxes became rows of velvet seats filled with mesmerized audience members. The dream would feel so real that opening her eyes to see the cluttered storage room almost hurt. But May never let herself dwell too long in those memories. She had bills to pay and a family to support back home. Every month, she dutifully sent money to help with her father's ongoing medical expenses. Her mother's grateful voice during their weekly phone calls reminded her why she had chosen this path. Still, she couldn't help but notice how her heart lifted every time she heard classical music playing in a customer's car radio or when the restaurant's background music featured traditional Chinese instruments. Those moments sparked a familiar fire in her soul, reminding her that beneath her practical exterior, an artist's heart continued to beat strongly. The lunch rush at Golden Palace restaurant was in full swing. Mai balanced 3 plates of steaming dumplings while expertly dodging between tables packed with hungry office workers. The kitchen doors swung back and forth like a pendulum as servers rushed in and out, calling orders over the din of clattering dishes and sizzling woks. Through the controlled chaos, May noticed something unusual. 2 well-dressed people stood near the entrance, speaking in hushed but intense tones with Mr. Chen, the restaurant owner. The woman wore an elegant blue suit that stood out among the casual lunch crowd, while her companion kept checking his phone with growing anxiety. Mai couldn't help but notice how the woman's perfectly manicured hands moved expressively as she spoke, her voice carrying notes of desperation. As Mai passed by with a pot of jasmine tea, fragments of their conversation caught her attention. The performance is in 5 hours. Entire fundraiser. Can't believe this is happening. The man with the phone rubbed his temples, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few minutes. Mr. Chen's usual cheerful expression had been replaced by genuine concern. I wish I could help, but I don't know anyone who could. He trailed off, shaking his head apologetically. May's heart skipped a beat when she heard the woman mention the Metropolitan Music Hall. She had walked past that grand building countless times, sometimes pausing to read the posters advertising world-class performances. On her late-night walks home from work, she would often stop and peer through its darkened windows, imagining what it would be like to perform on such a prestigious stage. While clearing a nearby table, Mai pieced together more of the story. The headline performer for that evening's charity gala had fallen ill. Something about food poisoning from a different restaurant. The event was meant to raise money for music education programs in underfunded schools. Now, with just hours to go, they had no performer and 300 wealthy donors expecting an evening of classical music. May's hands trembled slightly as she stacked plates, her mind racing. The storage room where she practiced seemed to call to her, and she could almost hear the sweet voice of her Eru. But the thought of stepping forward made her stomach twist into knots. She had built a quiet life here, far from the spotlight she'd once dreamed of. Was she really considering throwing herself into such a high-stakes situation? A crash from the kitchen snapped her back to reality. Through the kitchen doors, she could see the usual organized frenzy of lunch service, but her mind kept drifting to the desperate conversation by the entrance. The woman was now making rapid-fire phone calls, each one ending with a look of increasing disappointment. Mai watched as Mr. Chen offered them complimentary tea while they figured out their next steps. She noticed how the woman's hands shook slightly as she lifted the cup, likely imagining the disappointed faces of hundreds of donors and the children who would miss out on music education because of this disaster. The memory of her own childhood suddenly flooded back. The joy of holding an instrument for the first time, the pride in her parents' eyes during her first recital, the countless hours of practice that had shaped her into the musician she had been. Somewhere in this city, there were children who might never experience that joy without proper funding for music programs. Before she could talk herself out of it, May found herself walking toward the group. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the lunch crowd's chatter. Her hands felt cold and clammy as she cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help but overhear. I might be able to help." The woman looked up from her phone, curiosity mixing with skepticism on her face. Mai took a deep breath and continued, "I trained at the Shanghai Conservatory. I play the Eru. It's a traditional Chinese violin." The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly, while Mr. Chen stared at May, as if seeing her for the first time. The man with the phone stopped his nervous pacing, his attention suddenly focused entirely on the quiet waitress who had appeared like an answer to their prayers. "The Eru?" the woman repeated, hope creeping into her voice. Would you be willing to audition? Right now." The back storage room of Golden Palace restaurant felt smaller than usual as Mai led the small group inside. Her hands shook as she moved aside boxes of napkins and stacked chairs to create enough space. The familiar scent of dried spices and rice filled the air, mixing with the mustiness of cardboard boxes and cleaning supplies. "I keep it here," May explained softly, reaching behind a stack of takeout containers. She pulled out the worn instrument case, its leather surface scratched and faded from years of use. The woman in the blue suit watched intently, her earlier skepticism still visible in the slight furrow of her brow. As Mai opened the case, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the small window caught the Uru's polished wooden surface. Even in the dim storage room, the instrument seemed to glow with an inner warmth. The woman's expression softened slightly at the sight of such an obviously well-loved instrument. It was my grandmother's, May said, more to break the silence than anything else. Her fingers traced the familiar patterns in the wood as she lifted the erhu from its resting place. The two strangers exchanged glances, probably wondering if they were about to waste precious time listening to an amateur musician's dreams. Mai positioned herself on an overturned bucket, a far cry from the concert halls where she had once performed. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her racing heart. The last time she had played for anyone besides herself was 5 years ago, in a different life, on a different continent. Taking a deep breath, Mai placed the bow against the strings. She had chosen a piece that had always felt like home to her. The Moon Reflects on Erquan Spring, a classic composition that told the story of longing and hope. The first notes floated through the storage room, tentative at first, like a bird testing its wings. But then something magical happened. As the melody began to take shape, the storage room seemed to fade away. May's fingers remembered every note, every subtle change in pressure, every delicate shift in tempo. The music filled the small space, transforming it from a humble storage room into something else entirely. The piece spoke of moonlight on water, of memories that ripple like reflections on a pond, of dreams that persist even in the darkest nights. Mai felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she played, but she didn't stop. She poured everything into the music, her lost dreams, her daily struggles, her quiet hopes that had never quite died. When she finally opened her eyes, the woman in the blue suit was crying silently. Mr. Chen stood with his mouth slightly open, a stack of menus forgotten in his hands. Even the man with the phone had stopped his nervous fidgeting, staring at May as if seeing a ghost. I had no idea, Mr. Chen whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. All this time. The woman in the blue suit quickly wiped her eyes, her professional demeanor returning. But her voice was warm when she spoke. That was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. But the gala is in just a few hours. Are you certain you could perform? It's a very different environment from... She gestured at the storage room around them. Mai looked down at her waitress uniform, then at her erhu. The instrument felt alive in her hands, humming with possibilities. Fear and excitement battled in her chest. Playing here, in her safe space, was one thing. But performing in front of hundreds of people, after so many years, the thought made her dizzy. But then she remembered her grandmother's words. Music finds its way back to those who are meant to play it. Maybe this wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe this was music finding its way back. I can do it, May said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. I know many classical pieces, both Chinese and Western. I can prepare a program that would suit your audience. She carefully placed the erhu back in its case, her decision growing stronger with each passing moment. The man with the phone was already dialing numbers, walking out of the storage room with renewed energy. The woman reached into her elegant briefcase and pulled out a business card. We'll need to move quickly. Can you come with us right now to see the venue? We'll handle everything. Clothing, transportation, whatever you need. Mai looked at Mr. Chen, suddenly remembering she was still on shift. He smiled and waved his hand dismissively. Go, he said. Some things are meant to be. The taxi ride home felt like a dream. May clutched her erhu case tightly, watching the city blur past her window. The woman in the blue suit, who had introduced herself as the event coordinator, had insisted on sending her home to prepare, arranging to pick her up in 2 hours. That should give you enough time to get ready, she'd said, pressing a handful of cash into May's palm for a taxi and any emergency supplies she might need. May's tiny apartment had never felt so small as she rushed through the door. Her cat looked up lazily from its perch on the windowsill, watching its usually calm owner dart around like a hummingbird. She headed straight for her closet, pushing aside her waitress uniforms and casual clothes to reach the garment bag at the very back. Inside was the only formal dress she still owned, a deep purple gown she'd worn to her final conservatory performance. Her hands trembled as she unzipped the bag. The dress had been carefully preserved, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled as she pulled it out. 5 years had passed, but the silk still shimmered in the afternoon light streaming through her window. As she held the dress up to herself in the mirror, memories flooded back. The last time she'd worn it, she'd been a different person. A promising young musician with the world at her feet. Now her reflection showed someone else. A waitress with calloused hands and practical shoes, hair usually tied back in a simple ponytail. Mai laid the dress on her bed and rushed to shower, her mind racing through the pieces she would play. The event coordinator had been thrilled to learn she knew several Western classical pieces arranged for Eru, perfect for their audience. But May had also insisted on including traditional Chinese music. If she was going to do this, she would share her complete musical heritage. With her hair still damp, she began to practice. Her fingers moved across the erhu's strings, testing, remembering, making sure every note would be perfect. The familiar movements helped calm her racing heart, even as the clock ticked relentlessly forward. An hour later, she stood before her mirror again, hardly recognizing herself. The purple dress still fit, though a bit more snugly than before. Years of carrying heavy trays had changed her body, making her stronger in some ways, different in others. She had managed to style her hair in a simple but elegant updo, using skills nearly forgotten from her performance days. Her hands shook as she applied light makeup, another almost forgotten skill. In the restaurant, makeup was pointless. It would just sweat off during a long shift. But tonight was different. Tonight, she needed to look the part of a performer again. The most difficult moment came when she opened the small jewelry box on her dresser. Inside lay her mother's jade necklace, the last piece of jewelry they hadn't sold to pay for her father's medical bills. She hadn't worn it since coming to America, saving it for a special occasion that had never seemed to come. Until now. As she fastened the cool stone around her neck, her phone buzzed with a message from the event coordinator. Car arriving in 15 minutes. Are you ready? Ready. Was she ready? Mai looked around her small apartment, at the stack of restaurant schedules on her table, the comfortable shoes by the door, the life she'd built for herself here. In just a few hours, that life might change completely. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She walked to her window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as dusk approached. Somewhere out there, the Metropolitan Music Hall was waiting. Somewhere out there, an audience was gathering, not yet knowing that their evening's entertainment would come from a waitress at a local Chinese restaurant. Mai picked up her Eru case, its familiar weight somehow both comforting and daunting. She took one last look in the mirror, not at her dress or her hair, but at her eyes. They were her grandmother's eyes, bright with determination and a spark of that old dream that had never quite died. Her phone buzzed again. Car is downstairs. Mai took a deep breath, gave her cat one last pat, and walked to her door. As she turned the handle, she whispered her grandmother's favorite phrase. Music finds its way back to those who are meant to play it. Tonight, she would find out if those words were true. The Metropolitan Music Hall loomed before May like a palace from another world. Golden light spilled from its tall windows onto the sidewalk, where a stream of people in evening wear made their way up the grand stone steps. The car the coordinator had sent dropped her off at a side entrance, where a security guard checked her name against his list. Inside, the backstage area hummed with activity. Stage hands rushed back and forth, speaking in hushed but urgent tones into headsets. The click of May's borrowed heels echoed against the polished floors as a young assistant led her to a small dressing room. The space was bigger than her apartment's bathroom, with bright lights surrounding a mirror and a plush velvet chair. 15 minutes until the pre-show reception, the assistant said, leaving Mai alone with her thoughts and her reflection. Through the walls, She could hear the growing murmur of voices in the main hall. Each new burst of laughter or conversation made her heart beat faster. Curious, she crept to the stage wing and peeked out through the heavy curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. The hall was magnificent, all gold trim and rich red velvet, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over rows of seats. People were filling those seats now, men in crisp tuxedos and women dripping in jewelry that probably cost more than she made in a year. She recognized some faces from newspapers and magazines. There was the city's mayor, chatting with a famous tech company CEO. A renowned fashion designer air-kissed a movie star who had recently filmed in the city. These were people who regularly dined at five-star restaurants, not the kind of places where Maya carried plates of dumplings and refilled tea. They're expecting the famous violinist who was supposed to perform, whispered a stagehand who noticed her watching. No one's told them about the change yet. He gave her a sympathetic look before hurrying off to adjust some lighting. May retreated to her dressing room, her hands trembling as she opened her erhu case. The familiar sight of her instrument calmed her slightly, but doubt began creeping in. What was she thinking? These people had paid thousands of dollars for their tickets, expecting a world-famous performer. Instead, they were getting a waitress with an instrument many of them had probably never even heard of. She could hear the event coordinator making announcements in the hall, her voice muffled through the walls. Soon, she would announce the change in program. Soon, the whispers would start. Soon, May would have to walk out onto that stage and prove she deserved to be there. A knock at the door made her jump. The assistant poked her head in. 5 minutes, she said with an encouraging smile. They're serving champagne now. Always helps the audience warm up. May nodded, unable to speak. She stood, smoothing her purple dress with damp palms. The jade necklace felt cool against her skin, reminding her of her mother's strength, her grandmother's wisdom. She lifted her erhu, testing its weight in her hands one last time. Through the walls, she could hear the coordinator's voice growing clearer. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight change to tonight's program. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, questioning. May's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the rest of the announcement. Another knock, more urgent this time. 2 minutes, the assistant whispered. May closed her eyes, thinking of the storage room at Golden Palace where she had practiced for countless hours. She thought of Mr. Chen's surprised face when he heard her play, of her grandmother's words about music finding its way back. She thought of all the nights she had walked past this very building, dreaming of what it would be like to perform here. The assistant appeared one last time. They're ready for you. May stood, clutching her erhu like a shield. The purple silk of her dress rustled as she walked toward the stage, the sound nearly drowned out by the polite but uncertain applause from the hall. The bright stage lights beckoned through the curtain. It was time to step from one world into another. The stage lights were blinding as Mai stepped out into their warmth. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, studying her, wondering who this unexpected replacement was. The polite applause faltered slightly as people noticed her erhu, an instrument so different from the violin they had expected to see. Her purple dress sparkled under the lights as she bowed, just as she had been taught years ago at the conservatory. The stage felt massive around her, and the weight of the silence pressed against her ears. In the front row, she could make out the event coordinator's encouraging smile, though her hands were clasped tightly together in barely concealed nervousness. Mai sat down on the provided chair, positioning her erhu with practiced care. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the strings one last time. The audience waited, a mix of curiosity and skepticism hanging in the air. She caught fragments of whispered conversations. What kind of instrument is that? Where's the famous violinist? Is this some kind of joke? Taking a deep breath, May closed her eyes. In that moment of darkness, she wasn't on the grand stage anymore. She was back in her grandmother's house, learning her first notes. She was in the conservatory practice rooms, perfecting her technique. She was in the restaurant storage room, playing her heart out among the boxes and supplies. When she opened her eyes again, the stage lights didn't seem so harsh. Her fingers found their position, and she began to play. She started with a piece that bridged both worlds. A Western classical melody arranged for erhu, its familiar tune transformed by her instrument's unique voice. The first notes floated out over the audience, clear and pure. As the melody developed, she could feel the shift in the room. The whispers died away. The rustling of programs stopped. Even the subtle clicks of phones being used to Google erhu faded into silence. There was only the music, filling every corner of the grand hall with its story. The erhu sang of journeys across oceans, of dreams packed away but never forgotten, of humble work carried out with dignity. Its voice grew stronger with each phrase, and Mai felt herself growing stronger with it. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, drawing out sounds that made the audience lean forward in their seats. When the first piece ended, the silence lasted for 3 heartbeats before the applause began. It started tentatively, but grew stronger, genuine appreciation replacing polite obligation. May smiled softly and moved into her second piece. This time, a traditional Chinese composition that showed the full range of what the erhu could do. The 2-stringed instrument wept and soared, whispered and proclaimed. Mai poured everything into the music, her parents' sacrifice, her grandmother's wisdom, her own years of serving dumplings while dreaming of moments like this. The erhu's voice seemed to carry all these stories straight to the hearts of the listeners. She saw tears in the eyes of the fashion designer who had seemed so intimidating earlier. The tech CEO had put down his phone, his face softened with wonder. Even the mayor was sitting forward in his seat, completely absorbed in the performance. For her final piece, May chose the same song she had played in the storage room just hours ago. The moon reflects on Erquan spring. But this time, it wasn't just for herself or a small group of surprised listeners. This time, she played it for everyone who had ever held onto a dream while life led them down a different path. The last note lingered in the air like a star refusing to fade at dawn. Mai lowered her bow, her heart pounding. For a moment, the entire hall held its breath. Then the applause began. It started in the front row and spread like a wave, growing until it filled every corner of the hall. People were standing, their faces shining with genuine emotion. The event coordinator was crying openly now, all her earlier worry transformed into joy. May stood, her legs shaking slightly, and bowed again. The applause grew even louder. From the stage, she could see people turning to each other, talking animatedly, gesturing toward her and her erhu with expressions of amazement. The hall that had initially greeted her with skepticism now rang with appreciation and awe. In that moment, May wasn't just a waitress who played music in a storage room. She was exactly who she was meant to be, an artist sharing her gift with the world. And as the applause continued to wash over her, she felt her grandmother's words come true. Music had indeed found its way back. The days following the performance felt like a beautiful dream. May woke up the morning after to find her phone buzzing with messages. The event coordinator had shared her contact information with several music organizations, and now her inbox was full of opportunities she had never imagined possible. Local newspapers picked up the story, the waitress who had stepped in at the last minute and stunned the city's elite with her extraordinary talent. Regular customers at Golden Palace began asking for her autograph, their eyes wide with amazement when they recognized her from the news coverage. Some even brought their children to the restaurant, pointing her out and whispering, "See? You never know who might have an amazing gift." Mr. Chen hung a framed newspaper article about her performance on the restaurant wall, right next to the cash register. To remind everyone that dreams don't have expiration dates, he said with a proud smile. The storage room where she had practiced for so many nights became something of a legend among the staff, with new employees peeking inside as if they might catch an echo of her music. But the most meaningful change came in the form of a letter from the city's Music Education Foundation. They offered her a position that seemed created just for her, teaching music to children who couldn't afford private lessons, while also performing regular concerts at community centers and schools. The salary wasn't enormous, but it was enough to live on and still send money home to her family. We need someone who understands both worlds, the foundation director explained during their meeting. Someone who can show these kids that talent can bloom anywhere, even in unexpected places. May thought about all the nights she had spent practicing in that storage room, holding onto her dream even when it seemed impossible, and knew this was exactly where she belonged. She didn't leave the restaurant completely, though. Every Sunday afternoon, she still put on her waitress uniform and served dim sum to her regular customers. To keep my feet on the ground, she explained when people asked why she continued working there. But the truth was, the restaurant had become more than just a workplace. It was where her second chance had begun. The storage room transformed, too. Mr. Chen cleared it out properly and set up a small practice space, offering it to young musicians who needed a quiet place to play. Sometimes, after the restaurant closed, May would teach informal lessons there to waiters' children or young customers who showed interest in music. The room that had once hidden her talent now became a place where new dreams could take root. Her first official concert as a music foundation teacher was held in a community center, not the grand Metropolitan Music Hall. The audience sat in plastic chairs instead of velvet seats, and the stage was simply a cleared space at the front of the room. But when May looked out at the sea of faces, parents who had worked extra shifts to be there, children clutching cheap recorders and borrowed violins, her former coworkers from the restaurant beaming proudly, she felt just as moved as she had on that glittering night. One little girl approached her after the performance, eyes shining. "My mom works 2 jobs," she whispered, "just like you did. Can you teach me to play like that?" Mai knelt down to meet her eyes, recognizing in them the same spark she had once felt when first holding her grandmother's erhu. That evening, as Mai walked home from the community center, she passed by the Metropolitan Music Hall. Its grand facade glowed in the sunset, just as impressive as ever. But now, instead of feeling like a distant dream, it reminded her of the bridge she had built between 2 worlds. The world of high culture and elegant concert halls, and the world of storage room practices and double shifts. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother back in China. "We saw the video of your community concert," it read. "Grandmother always said music would find its way back to you. But you did more than that. You found a way to share it with others." May smiled, clutching her erhu case close as she walked through the busy city streets. The instrument no longer felt like a reminder of lost dreams, but rather a key that had unlocked a door to something even better, a chance to help others find their own music, wherever it might be hiding.